This is the audio for Chapter 9, Identities and Inequalities, the Future of Inequalities. So, inherent difficulties exist in promoting equality. While we have made some progress in attacking individual discrimination, the problem with inequality is that it can go deeper and become embedded in our social institutions and become institutional discrimination. Social movements are often what's needed to spur on social change that can affect those institutional inequalities, such as the civil rights movement, women's rights movement, queer rights movement, environmental movement, etc., etc., etc. The problem, though, is that a lot of people think when they look at these huge social problems that the problem is too big. So people can often feel hopeless when they learn about the gravity and scope of social inequalities and the resulting social problems. It can make us nihilistic and think that there's nothing that can be done. But in reality, we have agency. We're able to affect change in our own lives and in our greater communities. Often, we just need to collectivize and work together to form organizations and movements that can provide alternatives and solutions for the status quo and replace it with more equitable systems. Some of the various strategies they discussed in the book that have proven effective for even a small group of people to affect social change are using sit-ins, which are when you occupy a space to bring attention to an issue, a strategy made famous in the civil rights movement at lunch counters during Jim Crow's segregation. Work-ins are also fascinating to me. It's when workers take over the job, typically in situations where they were about to be laid off, in order to protest the layoffs. Also, teach-ins take place. These happen when someone knowledgeable on an issue sets up an informal space to educate those who are motivated to create social change, or to attempt to educate those that are ignorant to social issues that are around them. And die-ins are often used at protests, right? So people may cover themselves in red paint to symbolize blood, to bring attention to the consequences of those actions. But the book also points out it takes more than the actions of oppressed people for meaningful long-term change to occur. This is something that MLK talked about as well when he made the decision to allow children to protest and then face severe repression, being attacked by dogs and water hoses. He knew that the larger white society, some of them, needed to be involved in making these changes possible. So he basically tried to appeal to the consciousness, to the value systems of these groups. When people saw children being attacked by dogs on the nightly news, it affected their perceptions of the movement, right? So, when you look at women's rights, there's male allies. If you look at queer rights, there are heterosexual allies, right? There's often going to need to be some allies and accomplices, but really those allies need to make sure that they are centering the needs of the group of people that's the most marginalized. Okay, so when it comes to trying to predict unpredictable futures, obviously sociologists were not psychics, right? It can be very difficult, right? Discussing the future is also very important, but it can be dubious, right? More so than predicting the weather, because human behavior is erratic. So we look at projections, not predictions, because we don't have a crystal ball, right? So in the chapter, he discusses ethno-racial outlooks, that in the early 1900s to now time period, how much has changed. That, Americans lived distinctly separate racial worlds in 1900, right? There was only 30 years between slavery and Jim Crow segregation. The reality was most people took the divided racial landscape of America for granted. Many immigrants came to this country knowing English, practicing Christianity, so some of those expectations were also taken for granted as well. But now in the 21st century, things are much more diverse than before, and the growth of racial minority populations is also having an impact on the demographics of the country and those understandings. One thing they talked about in the chapter as well was the growth in the Latinx population, that soon the majority of Americans will point to a Latin ancestry, long overtaking the long-held white majority. So between 2000 and 2010, the general population increased by 8%, while the Latinx population grew by 43%. And also they talked about the demographic changes with religion, right? That we still assume everyone is Christian, right? It's a very strong hegemony in the culture, though there's much more religious diversity these days than in past generations. Yet most people still define themselves as religious. Instead of seeing this diversity as a strength, some see it as a threat to their assumed social dominance or the assumed prominence of their particular kind of Christianity. Okay, moving on to the assumptions of a post-racial society. So, some people try to say that the ethno-racial boundaries we have are just going to disappear when more people have interracial marriages, more children are born with multiracial or multi-ethnic identities, because that'll complicate the very few racial categories that we fit everyone into. And the attitudes that we have changed a bit, but again, people still may feel pressure to claim a single identity to fit into the scope of society. So what's important to really look at is how belief systems are affected by, the power of those who have the most privilege, right? So there's this interesting note that they make in the chapter about how the majority of whites in America feel that, the majority of racial groups now have the same opportunities to get jobs and everything else that they do. And particularly, this is the result of false narratives, that race is a problem of the past and a result of, also tokenizing successful people of color that helps people ignore the structural and cultural barriers that people still face every day in achieving success in America, right? This is also where people come up with that thing that's not a thing, reverse racism, right? But a lot of whites, when polled, think that that is real. They think that it's, that kind of discrimination is actually, again, it's not racism because it's not a social structure that has kept people locked out of opportunities for hundreds of years. So another problem, too, is that when people try to have clear conversations about these issues, often they're told that they're playing the race card. This is what we say when someone brings up things that either make white people uncomfortable or if they're saying that they're receiving unfair treatment because of their race. It's really just a way to be dismissive of the different status and experiences that people of color have, and it makes it seem like the individual has some sort of emotional problem, right? And again, if you dismiss it, it's just saying, hey, it's this person that's the problem. It's not, it's nothing systemic that we need to address. So a lot of these knee-jerk reactions we have in the culture to defending inequalities is the fact that if we deny them, then we can basically ignore that they exist and we don't have to actually do anything to fix them. So that becomes kind of a knee-jerk reaction for a lot of communities in privilege. So it's interesting, too, how there can even be discrimination in the absence of ethno-racial difference. So the example given in the book is Japan's Burikumen, that how, again, when there's not even distinct racial groups, we socially create difference. And that becomes reinforced generationally. So even though this group of people are biologically, religiously, and ethnically indistinguishable from other Japanese people, they're considered a completely different race that is inferior. So they were forced to live in special villages and wear recognizable clothing so they could be easily identified, right? They're stereotyped as mentally weak, aggressive, impulsive, and dirty. And while their treatment has improved in the last few years, as a whole, they still suffer more than other Japanese citizens, as they have the lowest incomes and the lowest educational attainment than any other group in Japan. So it's interesting, again, the importance here is that it shows how we socially create difference. So moving on to subdividing race and ethnicity, the author projects that maybe what will happen in the future is that we'll create more narrowly defined groups, such as ethnic group distinctions that will themselves have cultural, social, and legal recognition. Or maybe instead of calling everyone blank American, they will just reject pan-ethnic categories like Asian, Latinx, and Black or white that are vague, right, and include a diversity of groups in each. Another thing that's discussed in the chapter is Americanization. As more competition takes place in the economy and more groups struggle, there's a fear that more people will become kind of, that's not the best way to say it, MAGA motivated, and see racial and ethnic groups and protections for them to be the problem instead of being a solution to historical inequities. So according to, the book, this is a complicated process. As people that have less status gain more power, there's an inevitable pushback, right? And then as we discussed earlier in the class, According to Eduardo Bonilla Silva, the US is already evolving into an even more complex triracial system, right? Where he basically says that everyone gets redivided into the categories of whites, honorary whites, and collective blacks, as we discussed, right? That whites are at the top of this hierarchy. And the definition assumes assimilated Latinx, European, and urban Native Americans, while honorary whites are those who have received middle-class status, like a lot of Arab families and Asian groups, such as Japanese Americans and Chinese and Korean Americans. And then lastly, you have the collective black group, which has the least power and status in society and includes dark-skinned Latinx populations and dark-skinned Asian populations, Filipinos, Southeast Asians, and reservation-bound Native Americans. Okay, so when it comes to the future of gender and the sexual dichotomy, so dichotomous thinking is so built into our culture and the cultural institutions themselves that a lot of people, even though they don't identify with the gender binary, are raised within that context, are forced to live within that context of a binary. So it's not going to disappear immediately as a mechanism of social control because of the power it has in people's lives, even though there's a lot of changes in ideas of sex and gender over time in the culture, as we've already seen. And as they've changed in the past, they will continue to do so in the future, right? A lot of the understandings that we have build upon understandings from the past. And so this shapes and frames what we consider to be normative in the culture, right? We have much more terms that then arise linguistically to try to help better encapsulate communities and explain the specific conditions in which people live and really the conditions in which they, express their own gender identities and love one another. So this has, of course, because the definitions of gender and even the sex dichotomy, all of these assumptions underlies so many connections with other institutions that this has really shaped what we consider the normal family definition, right? This has changed a lot from the ideal of the male breadwinner and the female homemaker, which again, it was an ideal that was inherently classist and racist by design. But again, it does not reflect most American families. It didn't reflect the most American families in the past, and it certainly doesn't today. Also, changes in work and family have the potential to transform the meaning of gender in future generations. So if we expect more men to take on parenting roles, if we provide paid family leave, if we're more equitable to split domestic work, we can transform the gender expectations for future generations. Working families are very common, but so are stigmas against working mothers. We can change this sense as both parents working becomes much more normative in the culture. But careers are still modeled after traditional male careers of the past that rely on someone else's unpaid labor to make food, to clean clothes, etc., so that this, assumed male career holder can focus on his work. So we need to reframe these understandings and address this conflict between being a good employee and being a good parent. When it comes to the future of sexuality, obviously our understandings about sexuality continue to expand, right? And again, there's so much pushback against anything that challenges heteronormativity in our culture. It's nearly impossible to imagine a society in which some forms of sexual expression are not privileged over others, but the level of division is already starting to change. When it comes to public understandings and support for sexual minorities, just in my own lifetime, the kind of progress that's been seen is pretty remarkable. But obviously that doesn't change the fact that there's still so much more work that needs to be done in order for these inequities to actually disappear. The author argues that the future place of sexuality in the stratification system may have to do with legal recognition or having federal law to protect same-sex marriage and adoption, work protections, and other legal protections for different categories of people. And as we expand our definitions of understandings beyond the gay, lesbian, and bisexual community to also offer protections for those communities within their own families, within their own, within that legal structure to support them and make sure that they're not being marginalized. When it comes to distinctions between the rich and the poor, income inequality is increasing in our culture. So in this way, things are getting a lot worse. We have a handful of people in this country that have more money than the bottom 80% of the population, which should be criminal, but is instead protected by weak laws. The gaps are continuing to grow as the rich control the elected officials who tailor the laws and take away regulations and taxes on industries to benefit the rich. Plus, everything's getting more expensive, so the only people who can afford college, homes, etc. becomes, the rich people. So only the richest are able to do these things, are able to navigate the hurdles put there for us in the economy, while the rest of us struggle to get by. Even working multiple jobs has become the norm in our culture. But economic inequality depends on the choices we make as a society. So if we ask the rich to pay their taxes, right, a lot of that inequity would disappear. Or if the most profitable businesses actually had to pay taxes, we could reduce some of these overall gaps by using the money from the rich and those powerful corporations to build infrastructure, to fund education or make college affordable or free, to finance healthcare through universal coverage, and a million more examples like subsidized childcare and paid family leave, which are all things available in other developed countries that result in growth for all, as even the rich do better when the poor and middle class are doing well, because they can then actually buy all the shit that the rich people are selling. So it even benefits the rich if the middle class and the poor aren't struggling as much. When it comes to future intersections, we often fail to see the hardships that others experience. It's hard for most of us to see how one person losing their rights means that none of our rights are safe. It's a very slippery slope. It's hard for many to see how our thoughts, beliefs, and actions lead to and support other people's subordination and disadvantage. So if you're a white feminist, right, where you get gender oppression, but you ignore how race plays an important role, right? Or when we expand our views, the importance is being able to see that we're all privileged and oppressed at the same time, that we have a space in that matrix of domination, and that we can work together to deal with and really alleviate these problems. So meaningful social change can only take place when we realize that we're all experiencing some privilege or penalty from the existing power relations, seeing the relatedness of our identities instead of the difference. If we see the intersectional, we see how complicated and interwoven systems like race, class, gender, and sexuality are, along with age, nationality, immigration status, disability, religion, among many others. So we need to change the dichotomous thinking that limits our ability to see each other as people, and instead, when we often just put each other in binaries and see each other as this or that, which limits our ability to really fully understand who other people are and really fully understand ourselves.